What you see consistently in terms of bad behavior and good behavior, there's a lot of research in terms of that frames it in terms of time. So a short-term strategy versus a long-term strategy.
It's actually a really good point.
And if you think about it, in general, what's the reputation of used car salesmen? Not very good. Why? They're probably never going to see you again. Very short term. Versus, what's the general reputation of moms? Mom's going to be with you throughout the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So it's a longer term, type of strategy. So when you look at these kind of things, that's where all of a sudden the bad and good behavior starts to make a little bit more sense.
Everybody, welcome to Impact Theory. You are here, my friends, because you believe that human potential is nearly limitless, but you know that having potential is not the same as actually doing something with it. So our goal with this show and company is to introduce you to the people and ideas that will help you actually execute on your dreams. All right. Today's guest is a reformed screenwriter who traded in his tenure at luminary studios such as Disney and Fox to pursue his passion for fact-finding, which he turned into one of the most popular blogs on the internet. Over the past 8 years, his humorous and wildly informative articles have garnered him massive attention and helped him amass an army of dedicated followers numbering over 300,000 strong. And I am not the least bit surprised. His content is aimed at providing readers with science-based answers and expert insights into how to be, in his words, awesome at life. And he certainly delivers. I was so captivated by his debut book, Barking Up the Wrong Tree, the surprising science behind why everything you know about success is mostly wrong, that we had him scheduled on the show before I'd even finished reading it. His work challenges many of the long-held platitudes about what makes people successful and reveals the real, usable secrets to success. They're often surprising, at times a little unnerving if I'm completely honest, but always useful. And his insatiable curiosity and wondrous ability to succinctly summarize often hard to digest data has made him one of the most sought-after speaker educators working today. He's been invited to speak at such prestigious institutions as West Point, Yale, and MIT, and his writing has been featured everywhere from the New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, and prestigious publications such as Time Magazine and Business Insider regularly syndicate his content. He is quite literally redefining the rules of success. So please, my friends, help me in welcoming the best-selling author whose book was selected as the Financial Times Business Book of the Month, the creator of Bakadesuyo.com, which in Japanese ironically translates both as I am Barker and I am an idiot. The insightful, funny, and decidedly not idiotic Eric Barker. What's up, man?
Thank you so much for being on the show. It's great to be here.
Good to have you. And I have to say, I love that after learning what, and how do you pronounce it, by the way? That was my best.
Bakadesuyo.
Okay, so once you learned that that translates into I am Barker and I am an idiot, that you still made it your URL.
The first day of Japanese class, I found out, my last name means idiot in Japanese. So watashi wa baka desu means I am Barker. Watashi wa baka desu means I am an idiot. I've never had a Japanese person forget my name. In fact, they seem to love saying it.
That is hilarious. What made you take Japanese in the first place, which doesn't sound easy?
I wanted to do something different. I was like, I wanted to try something that was really out there and just so different, having 3 character systems and, just something that existed like in parallel rather than a Latin-based romance language, and just really see, what I could learn there. It was a lot of fun, but it wasn't easy.
Was this in high school or college?
This was college.
Okay.
And yeah, it was challenging, but it was really interesting because from a language you also learn a little bit about the culture, and you learn so much. It's really fun. I'm glad I chose it, even though it made studying a little harder.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. I actually really like how well that sort of personality trait of you of not looking for the easy path, of always being willing to sort of look underneath the hood and then embrace what you find, whether it's what your last name means, or one of the most interesting things that was in your book is the concept that feeling powerless at work can actually kill you, I think is the exact quote from your book.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
There's plenty of research that shows that, stress, stress in small amounts, can be a performance enhancer. When you're feeling groggy, when you're feeling tired, you're not at 100%. A little bit of stress is good, but a lot of stress, especially a lot of stress over a long period of time, we all know, this isn't good. And when you feel powerless at work, when you feel like you don't have autonomy, when you feel like nobody's listening to you, don't feel respected, stress levels, your cortisol levels go up. And over a period of time, not in a day or a week, but over a period of years, feeling like, what you do doesn't make a difference and feeling like you're not respected, having stress levels elevated like that, what you see is over time, years, decades, people are much more likely to have coronary incidents.
It's so interesting. It was one of the things in the book that, as you're detailing it, I'm like, that actually makes sense, but having such a fine point put on it, I found really, really surprising. So, you've been doing this blog for 8 years. So it started as a blog, Barking Up the Wrong Tree, evolves into the book that it now is.
Yeah.
In all of that research, which, by the way, for anybody discovering him for the first time right now, you're going to love how thoroughly he researches all this stuff, and the fact that the book is about how the things you've been taught about success are mostly wrong, I think really comes from the fact that you encounter these platitudes and as you dig deeper realize that they just don't hold up to the scrutiny of the data. What have you found most surprising in the data?
I mean, one of the things that was most surprising to me was Adam Grant's research in terms of nice guys finish last. Adam teaches at Wharton, and Adam's a very nice guy himself, and he split it up into givers, matchers, and takers as kind of the three groups he made. Givers are people who give altruistically, love helping people. Matchers are people who are strongly believe in fairness, so they try to keep an even balance of give and take. And takers are people who want to get as much as possible and give as little as possible.
Right.
So Adam looked at a bunch of careers, and then he looked at a variety of success metrics. And the initial results didn't make a nice guy like Adam feel very good, because at the initial results showed a disproportionate number of nice guys showing up at the bottom of success metrics across a number of fields. This was a little depressing. But when he did the thorough analysis, what he found out, the results were actually bimodal. It was basically a disproportionate number of nice guys were at the bottom, a disproportionate number of nice guys were at the top. And that might sound initially confusing, but really I think it's something we can all relate to, because we all know a martyr who, gets taken advantage of, gets walked on, does too much for others, doesn't do enough for themselves, and gets exploited. But we also know people who are really awesome, really great, go out of their way to help others. Everybody feels indebted to them, everybody loves them, and everybody is so happy to go out of their way to support that person and to do whatever they can. And so it's not an issue of, nice being bad or nice being weak. It's just an issue of how you handle that balance of wanting to give to others and doing it while not being a doormat, while not getting exploited.
One of the things that you detailed along those lines is the computer programs, the algorithms that they had compete. Talk to us about TFT, what that is. I found this really interesting. It was something that resonated with me a lot.
This was the research by Robert Axelrod that basically they're doing the prisoner's dilemma, which is a standard thing where, are you going to agree, or are you going to work with the other person, or are you going to defect to try and cheat them? And so he reached out to a lot of different experts in math and sociology and wherever to come up with an algorithm.
So let's go into a little more detail about the process. So it's something like, hey, you're being interrogated, and there's two of you that are in on the crime. And if you say nothing, you get 1 year?
So basically, So basically, you both commit a bank robbery, you both get arrested, you're being interrogated in separate rooms. If you both, say nothing, then you both get like 1 year in prison. If you defect, if you basically say he did it, then you do better, he does worse.
Right.
And if you both turn the other guy in, then you both do pretty bad. So if you could coordinate with the other person, but you can't, but if you could coordinate, you could both keep your mouth shut.
Right.
So the question there becomes, what's the optimal way, mathematically speaking, what is the optimal way to negotiate the prisoner's dilemma? So they had a bunch of different algorithms that would try different things. So you had some that were like always nice. They always cooperated, they never betrayed the other person, no matter what, because it's multiple rounds. And then you had ones that always tried to screw the other guy, no matter what. And then you had sneakier ones that would see, hey, on this round, can I cheat a little bit and then backpedal? How much can I get away with? And
are those meant to replicate the givers, matchers, and takers?
Well, there were two different. The Axelrod did his research like in the 80s. Okay. So this was around the time of the Cold War because they were trying to figure out, was there some way that the U.S. and Russia could cooperate?
Right.
So what was the optimal way? And what they basically found was comically, there are all these complex algorithms, and the one that by far did the best was something we all learned when we were kids. It was tit for tat. Basically, it was, okay, we go one round. I'm going to start off cooperating. If you cooperate, next round, I'll cooperate. If you defect, next round, I defect. And I will have no memory. So all I'm looking at is the last round. If you defect, fine, then I'll defect. But if you cooperate, then I'll join you again. Just tit for tat. I'm going to do whatever. I'm going to start out cooperating, and then I'm going to do whatever you did on the last round. And tit for tat destroyed everybody. Because what was interesting was initially tit for tat would lose. The bad guys would get the high ground very quickly because they were immediately attacking. But over time, tit for tat had some great things going for it in the sense that first, it always initially cooperated. So it showed goodwill. So past that, it wasn't a doormat. If you defected, it would defect right back. So it had that balance of, hey, I'm going to show goodwill, but I'm not going to take any crap. And the really thing I think we can really take away from this that's valuable is it also educated the other person in how to play, as opposed to a punishing. There were other algorithms that would start off cooperating, and we all know people like this. Start off cooperating, and the minute you defected, that's it. I'm never going to trust you again. Defect. I don't care what you do. I don't trust you now. And so this was a kind of an educational process. So if you think, it makes sense. It maps on to longer term negotiations, where if you're going to have to deal with somebody over a longer period of time, this educational process where, okay, this, you're going a little too far. Okay, we're teaching each other how to talk to one another.
Right.
So if you cooperate, you defected, okay, I'm going to defect back. You're going to cooperate now? Okay, I'm going to cooperate now. There was an ongoing conversation. So in the short term, the bad guys took the high ground, but in the long term, very often, whenever tit for tat would meet another good program, the gains were exponential. When I met a bad program, it wasn't going to take any crap, so the losses were small. And the programs that were in the middle, it managed to kind of teach them, hey, if you're gonna screw me over, I'm going to screw you back. But if you're good, I'll be good. And they realized being good was in their best interest.
One of the funniest parts of your book is where you go into like this long, like page after page after page diatribe of like all the ways that being nice can be punished, and you finally end it by saying, I would keep going, but my publisher won't let me release this with antidepressants.
Yeah.
Like, talk to us about that early lead that jerks can get, and how does that play out like in a concrete sort of business environment?
I mean, very often, bad traits, there's what you see consistently in terms of bad behavior and good behavior. There's a lot of research in terms of, that frames it in terms of time. So a short-term strategy versus a long-term strategy.
It's actually a really good point.
And, if you think about it, in general, what's the reputation of used car salesmen? Not very good. Why? They're probably never going to see you again. Very short term. So if we map that onto the prisoner's dilemma, if there's only 1 or 2 rounds, if I can get the high ground, I can just win.
Right.
You're not going to get a chance to retaliate. Versus, what's the general reputation of moms? Mom's going to be with you throughout the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So, mom's going to take care of, mom's going to be there. It's a longer term, type of strategy. So when you look at these kind of things, that's where all of a sudden the bad and good behavior starts to make a little bit more sense. Where, initially, you look at narcissists. Narcissists do better in job interviews. They do better on first dates. And initially, these things look really good. But by the same token, if you go a few weeks after starting a job, narcissists are generally regarded as untrustworthy. After a few months of a relationship satisfaction of the other partner tanks. It's this shorter term strategy, grab all I can. So one of the strategies that people can use, so for a takeaway from this, is that if you find yourself you're involved or in an encounter, a deal or whatever, with somebody who you're not so sure if you can trust them, they call it lengthening the shadow of the future. If I build more steps into the contract, if I stretch this out, if they know there's going to be a chance for retaliation, there's going to be a chance for renegotiation, then people behave better because they know they have to. How do people behave? If you meet somebody off the street, that's one thing. If you're introduced to someone by a mutual friend, you're probably going to be a little bit nicer. You don't want your friend to get upset with you. Now, so very often in these kind of one-off type encounters, bad behavior can pay off. It's sad, but when it's stretched out, very often there's a chance for retaliation, and more importantly, we develop a reputation. People talk. There's gossip. And if you develop a reputation where people say you can trust this person over time, that benefits us. And if somebody says, yeah, they seem really nice, they're a fast talker, but don't trust them, that comes back to haunt them.
You talk really well in the book about how one of the most dangerous places for a giver is to be in an organization full of takers. Because there's no other givers there to protect you and sort of create a buffer. What advice would you give if you had a friend who was a giver in the midst of a bunch of takers and they can't leave for whatever reason? Financially, they're strapped. They just right now they can't afford to leave the job. Would you advise them to adopt taker strategies, or would you give them other advice?
I mean, if they can't leave, then what you get from Robert Axelrod's research was that, because they tried it where they had like multiple games going on, circle the wagons. Is what I would say, is find the few givers or few matchers that are there and affiliate tightly with them and work through them and with them. Because obviously being surrounded by takers, especially when your natural instinct is to be a giver, is really dangerous. Number one, you can get exploited. Number two, over time, you can become a taker yourself. Bob Sutton, who's a professor at Stanford, gave some great advice where he said, whenever you interview at a company, look around at the people at that company, because you're going to become like them. They're not going to become like you.
I love that.
We always talk about peer pressure in relation to teenagers. Peer pressure affects us our entire lives. We are always influenced by our context and by the people around us. The biggest danger there is we don't realize it. We are always influenced. So the thing that givers need to keep in mind is that if they find other givers, boom, they're helping each other, their favors, and they're both kind of on the lookout for being exploited. But matchers can also be valuable as well. Because matchers, it's not merely that they want to keep a balance of give and take. Matchers typically have a strong belief in justice. So matchers are very happy to punish takers and to reward givers. So with other givers can do very well. They can produce great things at work. And if givers manage to surround themselves with matchers, then they end up with bodyguards. So it's basically seek out those people and circle the wagons as best you can.
Do you think that applies in like interpersonal relationships outside of work? Like when you're thinking about looking for a spouse, like is that something to take into consideration?
I think it's something to take into consideration in every area of life. You know, we all have, I mean, at work, obviously it's very clear because of the amount of transactional relationships that go on. But in your personal life, we all have friends who some of them do so much for you that you almost feel guilty. Other ones seem to only come around when they're asking you for favors. And some of them, hey, they help you out, you help them out. You know, so it really behooves us to always be thinking, to some degree, okay, givers, matchers, takers, who can I trust and when? You know, who's there in the good times, who's there in the bad times? I think it's always valuable.
You talked about context a second ago. I want to go back to that. So you've got this notion of intensifiers, things that you were talking about genes, and like genes aren't necessarily good, they're not necessarily bad, but given context, they can really play out differently. How should people, because I get asked a lot, you know, about, okay, do I double down on my strengths? Do I puff up a weakness? Like, what do I do? And the notion of intensifiers really caught my eye because it was, well, maybe that's the fundamentally wrong question. Maybe you should be asking, given the way that I am, what context should I be seeking?
I totally agree. I think that's definitely the way to go. Gautam Mukunda, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, teaches leadership, and he came up with this notion of intensifiers, of the attitudes where we say a lot of personality traits or qualities are just bad. And that really doesn't hold up to scrutiny. You know, if you think about it, in interpersonal relationships, stubbornness is rarely considered a good quality. That's a bad thing. You should get rid of your stubbornness. However, we're also very quick to say, entrepreneurs, you got to be gritty. Stick by your guns. Don't listen to the haters. Sounds a lot like stubbornness to me. So in context is where it really becomes critical. So yes, in your interpersonal relationships, stubbornness, not so good. But if you're an entrepreneur or if you're doing anything that's really difficult, stubbornness can pay off. So as opposed to, be smart, which we would say is a universally good trait, intensifiers are qualities which on average, at the mean, are usually considered negative, but in the right context can be considered very positive. Being overly aggressive, might be considered a negative in general. Well, if you're hiring a litigator, you might want somebody who's overly aggressive because that might be. So again, in this context. So a big part of it is realizing, like you're saying, who you are, and then aligning your context so that your context rewards both your signature strengths, the research done by Martin Seligman at University of Pennsylvania, what are you uniquely good at, but also your intensifiers, where here's my negative qualities, here's what I get criticized for, but here, stubbornness is an advantage. Here, being overly aggressive is a benefit. So I'm going to line up my signature strengths, my intensifiers with my environment so I'm rewarded for those rather than punished, because it's so hard to bring up your weaknesses. You see much greater gains by trying to double down on your strengths. And the first key is knowing what your strengths are, knowing yourself, admitting your weaknesses, knowing what your intensifiers can be. And then when you align that with the proper context, I call it picking the right pond, you see that, boom, everything, your good traits and your bad traits can potentially benefit you.
One of the examples you give in the book was something like, if you want to be successful in business, pick a drug addict or something like that?
Was basically, the thing is with narcissists often rise to leadership positions. And so that's where we get a lot of the advice in terms of, be uber confident, be dominant, be everything. Because narcissists usually rise to leadership positions. However, they don't necessarily succeed in leadership positions. There's getting the job versus being able to do the job.
Right.
And narcissists
great distinction.
Typically, rise or fall in terms of their performance, in terms of the opportunity for glory. So
that's interesting.
And what's dangerous there is, obviously, if a company's doing well, hey, lots of money, lots of rewards, lots of things. So when companies are at their worst is when you need people to pick up their performance, right. And it's when narcissists are least likely to be engaged. Stock value's dropping, I'm not gonna get rewarded here. They do less. On the other hand, and I'm to some degree I was being funny, but one researcher at Johns Hopkins was saying that narcissist is not the personality type that you would want for a leader. The obsessiveness of a junkie, the focus of a junkie, and basically he was referring to neuroscience research, right. In terms of someone who is just obsessed. And what do we see when we every profile you read of Silicon Valley billionaires is just always, obsessed, only sleeps 4 hours a night, only thinks about this, works, reducing their workload to 80 hours a week, that obsessiveness versus just, I want to look cool is, so the junkie attitude is a better perspective than the narcissist desire for glory when you're looking for a leader who's going to perform.
What drives you? You work an insane amount of hours. Like you said when you were doing the book that you were working 4 days a week on the book and then 3 days a week on the blog. And I thought, oh God, like the amount of words you have to write. You've written, what, 5,000 articles or something at this point?
Yeah.
It's insanity.
Yeah.
What's the thing that pushes you?
I mean, I'm excited by what I do. I mean, I really enjoy reading. I really enjoy learning. I'm always, like your shirt, I'm always questioning everything. So I'm really, really curious. And so I'll be checking these things, and then, very often, I have to read 5 books to find the one book that's really interesting. I read 5 studies to find the one study, but then, I'll call the authors or I'll call the researchers, and I get to talk to the smartest people about like really cool stuff. To me, that's just intoxicating. So for me, it's not. I guess it's just an issue of perspective where work's not work if you enjoy it. So to me, it's like what's that next thing? What's that next insight? And just being able to see how when I apply things to my life and it makes a difference, and then to know that I can share it with hundreds of thousands of people, it feels good. So there's kind of just this reinforcing cycle. So for me, it's just fun.
Walk me through your career, so you go into film, working for some of the biggest companies on the planet.
Yeah.
But you've reinvented yourself several times. What was that like? Take us inside, sort of where your mind was, what you were feeling, and how you had the courage to totally reinvent yourself multiple times?
I mean, I was always somebody who was focused on like big ideas and asking questions. And so my undergrad was in philosophy, oddly enough. But then I did an internship, and in Hollywood, was really excited. I came out, and I got really lucky really fast. I came out one year. Next year, I got an agent. Next year, I sold a script. Next year, I had 2 movies made, and then I got some great.
I really tried to find you on IMDb. Like, are you hiding?
You can see some of the movies I've had produced and some of the projects I've worked on, but I don't know. Maybe I'm not so proud anymore of what I was writing when I was 22, 23, but I did for a while. But it's like Hollywood, the writer doesn't have much control, and I just found that was not fun to be on this roller coaster.
Right.
And I started asking some big questions of myself. And when I got a master's degree at UCLA in film, that really I'm really asking a lot of questions. And then I stepped back, and then I went, oddly enough, and I went and I got an MBA, and I didn't fit in there at all. Some Mr. Creative Screenwriter guy.
Started doing marketing for video games and stuff?
Yeah, and I worked on the BioShock franchise, and I worked for a couple different companies. Wow. But it was after I got the MBA, and I still felt like, what am I doing? I don't have the answers here. That I started the blog, because I didn't want to take a job I didn't enjoy. I was unemployed for 9 months, so I was playing around on the internet. It was just something I wanted to do, and then I started doing interviews because I wanted to talk to experts. And initially it was just academic research. Then I started looking at the books the researchers had done. And then I decided to even take a step further than that, because, academic research in science is great, but they haven't covered everything. So I started looking at experts in particular fields, because everything has not been covered, in social science research. So I started drawing on some friends of mine, and my one friend, Chris Voss, is a former lead international hostage negotiator for the FBI. Okay, well, here's a guy who knows about negotiation. Might not be based on formal research, but people live or die based on whether he's good at his job.
Right.
Good enough for me. So I call up Chris. How do we negotiate? My friend James Waters, Navy SEAL platoon commander. Okay, well, let's find out about grit, because if you can do what you had to do to get where you got, I want to know what did that.
This was a really interesting part of the book. Talk about, they were surprised by what they found. So we're post 9/11. They're really trying to get people in.
Yeah.
They realized we either have to lower our standards or find a way to get more people to pass. Lowering our standards sounds like a bad idea.
Yeah.
So what was it that they did? I found this really interesting.
Basically, the Navy had set up this incredible BUDS, basic underwater demolition training was basically set up, to vet people, to see who are the toughest of the tough, who are the people who will not give up, and those were the people who would become Navy SEALs. But the military hadn't done an excellent job of figuring out what those qualities actually were. They could vet for them. Can this guy stay up during Hell Week? Can this guy, make the runs, do the swims, put up with, all the hazing and abuse? Yeah, but what were the qualities that actually allowed them to get through? And the Navy did research, and what was amazing was just a handful of things. And the critical one I talk about in the book was self-talk. Optimistic self-talk was just, we all have that voice in our head.
And they started training for this, right?
Absolutely. They basically took the results of the study, so it's like self-talk, goal setting, and they basically started teaching students there, because you don't want to lower the standards, and you don't want to give the answers to the test, but if you can mold these guys to incorporate these elements, then great. So they started teaching them, and they improved, I think almost like 8 to 10% passing rate improved once you started teaching recruits how to incorporate, optimistic self-talk and these other habits. Because when we talk about grit, when we talk about persistence for long-term goals, one of the things that's been most proven is an optimistic mindset. You look at research by Angela Duckworth, by Martin Seligman at University of Pennsylvania, is that having that optimistic mindset. Because when you believe, hey, if I show up tomorrow, it's going to work out, then you show up. It makes sense. And if you firmly believe, I'm going to go there tomorrow, and it's going to be a waste of my time, and I'm going to feel, well, what do? It feels futile.
Right.
And over long-term goals, if you feel like it's going to happen, now that's not going to warp reality necessarily. What you do might, but But if you don't show up, if you feel like there's no point to it, you're not going to do it.
Right.
And it comes down to that belief that positive things, they're personal. I was responsible. They're pervasive. Hey, across a range of areas, I can do this, and it's persistent. If I do this, it's going to work out. And people who are pessimistic believe the reverse, and so things start to feel futile. When things start to feel futile, why continue? Doesn't make any sense. And what Seligman's research also showed is that if that attitude continues long enough or hard enough, that's how you actually end up with clinical depression. Because when life feels futile, when it does not feel like continuing anything is going to pay off, then you start to shrug your shoulders and say, what am I doing? So optimism is strongly correlated with happiness, and pessimism is strongly correlated with not only quitting, but also with depression.
Yeah, it was this point in the book, and I remember, so I hadn't found your blog yet, unfortunately for me, and I'm reading the book, which was Audible just recommended it, and I'm, look, barking up the wrong tree. What I know about success is wrong. Like, I had to read your book, right? Because I'm all about, like, find the evidence that pushes you forward rather than just confirms. So that was way too enticing for me not to read it. Then I get to that part in the book, I'm like, who is this guy? Like, this stuff is amazing. The notion of optimism being teachable, first of all, that it had such a huge impact on the number of people going through. And then you took it somewhere which is like my personal fetish, especially as a screenwriter. I was like, who has left the field, and I'm sort of going the other way. I started in business, now going back to screenwriting and saying the whole notion around narrative. And that what is it about narrative that they found was so impactful? Stories
are basically the operating system of the human brain. If you look across the board, across a bunch of areas of research, it's quite fascinating. John Gottman, who's done leading expert in terms of relationships, marriages. The most indicating thing in terms of whether a couple will get divorced or not is how they tell their story. Is merely saying, oh, so tell me the story of your relationship. How did you two meet? And if it's, oh my God, it was so wonderful, it was this and great, and then we had challenges, but we overcame them, we got to know each other better, we grew together, versus, it's like, oh, we met up, we had, we've had some problems, but I mean, just hearing that story is a huge indicator in terms of the success of children. If a child knows its family history, it's a huge impact on how successful that kid is in school, how well adjusted.
An example of that. Like, when you say knows their family story, what do you mean?
Again, that issue of, okay, your great-grandfather, immigrated here from this.
And if they tell a story that's sort of positive and empowering.
And they're a part of something. They're a part of something, it gives reason, it gives meaning. And what you see across the board with that, with when you look at what therapists do very often is fixing people's stories. I'm a loser, I've always been a loser, this didn't work out, that didn't work out, I can't. Versus, you can take the same events and say, oh, this didn't work out, but that's the day I learned a great lesson, which, same events, but you're telling them in a different way. So very often, it's not about the specifics of what happened. We've all had successes, we've all had failures. But which ones do we choose to define ourselves by? It's that story in our head that keeps us going. And so it's deeply important for meaning, but also deeply important in terms of grit, resilience, persistence. Because again, that story you tell yourself, do you tell yourself, I'm the kind of person who, I'm never going to make it through this. I quit at this, I quit at that. Or, I'm not a quitter. That's the story I tell myself. People want to seek out things that support their story. They want to fulfill their story. We all know someone who has this vision of their self in a certain way, and you present them with that challenge of, you think you're so smart? Well, could you do that? And people often jump to the challenge. Why? Because they want to support their story. And we have this evolving story of ourselves. And it's really critical, for us to feel that, we are part of this, because we've all had how many moments in our lives, how many ups, how many downs. We don't remember all of them. We don't recall all of them, and we don't make all of them part of our story. There's 1,000 different ways to frame the decades that have gone by. We can shape them many ways. And how we do actually has a huge effect on whether we persist, how happy we are, and the decisions we make going forward.
Yeah, when you said that one of the most important things that a therapist does is spend time fixing people's stories, man, that is so important to understand. Like, A, how malleable the stories are, and then really where their importance lies. One of the things you talk about in the book, which I loved, I took so many notes on this, was what makes stories so effective is that they abstract, that they're not necessarily accurate, that they allow us, you said, to put rose-colored glasses on. Talk about that.
This was something that Tyler Cowen, an economics professor, big blogger and economics professor at George Mason University, talked about, which we don't think about when we hear it. It makes sense, which is that stories are always narrowed. They're always edited. You've been alive for decades. You're not considering every second that went by. You're taking little snapshots. To tell a story, you leave out, even if you're telling a joke. You only tell the parts that are important to that joke. And so stories are always inaccurate because you might say, I consider myself a good person. You ever done anything bad? You ever done anything you're not proud of? Of course you have. But you're, to some degree, selecting those things, and you feel those are more representative of who you are. And somebody who doesn't feel they're such a good person is selecting different. What's the raw total score of good versus bad versus, we don't know. So stories are always, inaccurate. Unless we're going to recount every second of your life and take we can't. So stories are always a reduced, shortened version, and they usually have a point. They usually result in, I feel I'm a good person. I'm persistent.
Yeah, and the real power in that I hope people take away is that ultimately it's up to you as the person telling yourself that story to decide what you leave in and what you leave out, which I'm sure is exactly what the therapist is helping them do, is either just reframe the exact same moment or, hey, in your decades of experience, start pulling different moments, those moments that you are proud of, instead of focusing on the moments that you're not proud of.
That's huge. A lot of this research was work by Tim Wilson at UVA, and he talks about, again, therapists, story editing, reframing, looking at different events. But there's also something else we can do, because some people can do that very well. If somebody has done great things, but they feel like a loser.
Right.
Then reframing can work really well, highlighting different things. Other people might feel like, I haven't accomplished much. And for that, Tim Wilson recommends something I think is wonderful, which is called Do Good, Be Good. And they've done research to show this works, where rather than people we're always thinking, no. You want to feel like a better person? Okay, start volunteering once a week. Go out and do it. And then what will happen is the story will follow. Because it's going to be really hard. If you start saying, hey, every paycheck, I'm going to donate X amount to charity. Every week, I'm going to volunteer to help people. All of a sudden, you're going to find after a few months, it's kind of hard to tell yourself, oh yeah, I'm a terrible person. Because you're going to tell other people, oh, I'm a little short on money because I donate to charity, and I can't go Sunday. That's when I volunteer.
Right.
And you're going to start to follow, your story will follow your behavior. So if you have trouble changing your story, first change your behavior. And Don Quixote, it's like, you want to be a knight, act like a knight.
Right. I love that. Absolutely love that. And you had research in there that talks about like chunking that time up. Yeah, walk us through that.
Well, that ties in with Adam Grant's research in terms of givers and takers. The givers, the givers were disproportionately represented at the top and at the bottom. Well, who are the ones at the bottom? The ones at the bottom were the ones who did too much. They were always focusing on others. They were martyrs.
Right.
And so chunking is the idea of, hey, how am I going to sustainably be able to help other people if I'm doing pretty well myself? If I make more money, I can donate more money. So basically the idea of saying, I am going to devote, my Sundays to, that's when I do my good deeds.
Right.
Or, at work, basically saying, okay, Thursday afternoons, that's a time when things are a little slow. It's not crazy like Monday. It's not get everything done by Friday. Thursday afternoons, anybody who needs me or anybody who's, hey, can I pick your brain? That's when that is devoted to that. That is devoted to that. So by saying, chunking, I'm going to do my good deeds here, number one, it makes sure they happen. And number two, it makes sure that they don't just keep going. Because once you say to people, hey, I want to help, you might get more requests than you can possibly fulfill. So having a budget of time, any resource to assist people in designating it allows it to make sure it happens. So you are a giver, but also make sure that it doesn't take over your life.
I love that. And talk to me a little bit about knowing when to quit. So that was one of the things I really found fascinating in the book, and I think this is so important, is what's the difference between quit and grit? Like, how do you know like when to lean where?
Yeah, because grit and quit is huge. Like, grit is having its moment in the sun now where everybody's talking about grit, but we can't, you have to quit some things. You only have 24 hours in a day.
Right.
If I'd never quit anything, I'd still be playing with action figures and I'd still be playing t-ball. Right. You know, you quit things, you move on. So the truth is that strategic quitting the right things, can actually benefit grit because you have more time. So if you want those K. Anders Ericsson 10,000 hours of expertise, where there's only 24 hours in a day, that's it. So the more stuff you quit that isn't delivering value to your life, the more resources, the more time and energy you have to really become good at something. So quitting becomes critical. But that leads us to the tough question, which is, how do you know what to quit, you know, what to stick with? And, you know, it's like we have our passions, we have our interests, you know, we have what clearly provides value, but there's some fascinating research came out of NYU that basically have this wonderful little word, WHOOP. And it was basically a plan for how people can take their ideas, using research, take their ideas from a dream to an actual plan. And what they found basically is we think like, oh, dreaming about dreaming. The thing that's dangerous about dreams is on their own. Dreams are a good first step, but wishing on its own actually saps energy. It doesn't create energy because our brain is not very good at telling fiction from reality. That's why movies are exciting. You know, if we just saw it as, oh, that's pixels on a screen, that wouldn't be exciting. But you know, when you get thrills, because we're not always good at that. So when we dream, our brain starts to think we already have that.
Right.
And energy levels go down.
So interesting.
So we can start by wishing, but then the next thing that needs to happen is we need to crystallize what we want.
Why do you think though, so I mean, I have my own answer, but why do you think if wishing, fantasizing, dreaming about it pacifies you because some part of your brain doesn't realize you don't actually have it, why do we start there?
We start there because we're kind of looking to what do we want? What do we desire? You know, you
so
look
you
around.
think it is important to paint a picture of what you want, you just can't get lost in it.
The problem is when you stop there. You know, wishing and dreaming is critical. You need to think about what you want. You want to have dreams. But the problem is that basically if wishing by itself is just, it's the equivalent of like alcohol. Feels good in the moment, but it doesn't necessarily make you more productive. So we need to take the next step. The next step is to think outcome. So WOOP, wish. Second thing is outcome, which is what is the specific thing I want? Oh, I want to be rich and famous. And what's the final outcome?
Right.
What is that thing going to be? And then once you have a specific idea, you know, this is what I want to be. Then the critical part, which is obstacle. What's in the way? What is that thing I have to overcome to get what I want? And most people don't. That's tough. That's not as fun as just thinking about Learjets. So, you know, wish, outcome, obstacle. And then once you think about the obstacle, you can make a plan. How can I overcome that? What's the next step? Now, what's great is that leads people towards what's called implementation intentions, which is basically a plan for how you can get your dreams. But what's also fascinating is in terms of the grit or quit question, is that when the research was done, what they found was that how people felt after doing the exercise was very telling. People who felt energized and excited, that was generally an indicator that this was a realistic possibility, that they had a dream, but when they thought about the obstacle, it was surmountable by their plan, great. When people realized that, wait, this plan is not going to get over this obstacle and is not going to get me my dream, people didn't feel as energized, and it became a litmus test for sort of determining, you know, do I need a new plan? Is this plan not really addressing the issue? Or is this dream completely unrealistic? You know, so it can be useful in terms of grit or quit, because if you feel energized by it, great, go do it. This is something you should be sticking with. If you don't feel it, okay, fine. Maybe you need to reevaluate your plan, or maybe you need to reevaluate your dream.
That's the first effective strategy for breaking down when people ask me about that, and I say, look, you've got to know when to stick with something and when to give up if you're not enjoying it. But in that, I'm always like, God, I don't really know what I'm telling them to do, because it's like sort of gut instinct, but that's like an awesome process. Do you have a similar process? Because the other question I get asked all the time is, how do I find my passion? Which I am a fiery believer that you don't find it, you develop it. But like, How do people, do you have a process for people figuring that out?
I think what you said is exactly right. It's the issue of development. And Peter Sims wrote this great book called Little Bets, where it turns out to be a system that's used across the board in many different areas for people to kind of find their passion, find their interest, find things they're good at. And basically it's like treating your time almost like a venture capitalist, where little bets are small, little efforts. You're not going to put in a ton of time, energy, or money. You're going to try a bunch of things, and you're going to see what works, what you enjoy or what you're good at. And so like a VC firm might say, all right, 10 companies, I know 7 are going to fail. No problem. 2 are probably going to break even, and 1's going to be the next Facebook or Google, and that works for me.
Right.
Well, to say to yourself, I'm going to try 10 different things. I'm going to take a yoga class. I'm going to take a martial arts class. I'm going to read this book. And 7 of them, I'm probably going to say, no thanks, But 2, I might say, there's potential here. And 1 might be that great new opportunity. Because the world is changing. The world's changing so much that we can't afford to be left behind. So you want to be trying stuff. If your grit and focus is fantastic, but you don't want to be working on horses and buggies when the car is being developed. You don't want to fall behind. So to always be devoting 5 to 10% of your time to trying something new in a low investment sort of way to give it a shot, that's what's going to help you find the next big thing, find what you're passionate about. If you're not trying, you can't find your passion.
I like that a lot. You're very excitable.
Yeah.
That's clear. Has there ever been a time where you were sort of stuck, there was nothing really calling for you, where you have sort of I'll put it back in the context of your normal writing the blog, so you're going through all the research papers and things like that. So you're not necessarily doing the small bets and looking for something. How do you, within that universe, if your excitement is sort of flagging, do you have a process to tap back into something?
Basically, for me, it's about just getting some kindling that curiosity, where it's like asking that question. Because I definitely get times where not feeling it, it's not happening,
right.
And what I need is something that starts me asking a question. Because even if I read a book and I'm like, there's nothing here, this isn't really going to help me, sometimes I'll find myself going, well, then what was I looking for? Oh, well, I was looking for this. Okay, well, is there anything on that?
Right.
And then all of a sudden I'm on Amazon, I'm going, I can't believe that. Nobody's written a book on this subject, there's gotta be some reason. I'm on Google Scholar, and I'm like, oh, wait a second.
Right.
Hey, I know. Once I start that question asking, once I get a question that makes me go, now I need to know. Because we've all felt that to some degree, where all of a sudden you find yourself on Wikipedia, and then somehow a half hour went by and I'm clicking around, and now I know more about the Peloponnesian War than anybody. And for me, that's what it's about. Is if I'm not feeling it, I have to start to say, like, what am I curious about? What is it? And anything that I can do. So I want to start throwing stuff at myself. I want to start, watching a documentary. I want to start, reading a book, reading an article that makes me start to ask a question. And then sometimes, if it is more general, then I can just go down that rabbit hole.
Right.
If it's more specific, then I literally have to try and trick myself into how does that relate to what I'm curious about this. Can I redirect that passion? Because I know once I get going, I'm like a terrier with a frisbee. Like I'm just not going to let go. But I have to get that curiosity engine kind of going, where there's like, okay, I need the answer to this question.
Now, you've had some articles that have really popped. What do they have in common, the ones that have just really knocked it out of the park? Are there any threads?
I mean, across the board, I think it's, first off, it's things that interest most people, because, so issues of happiness, connecting with others, things that are universal. But second, I think it's having really legitimate science, where people are like, okay, I'm comfortable with this. And then I think beyond that is, having a level of warmth and accessibility. Because the truth is, so much of what I post, I mean, sometimes the book you might have to find and buy.
Right.
But most of these research studies, you can just Google. You don't have to listen to me.
Right.
You can just Google, but it's not fun. They're not interesting. They use big words. They're not like, they're not, there's so many just layers of just, it's not, you know, it's not this kind of fun journey. And so it's like highlighting the stuff that's counterintuitive, asking, you know, the questions that I might ask as a reader, which people can probably relate to, you know, making it accessible, making it a little fun, throwing in a little humor, you know, that's just kind of like, you know, having a little sugar to make the medicine go down, where, you know, where just like you're kind of feeling it, you're enjoying it. And I think that makes all the difference in the world, making it accessible. And so I think finding that balance of something which is useful, something which is accessible, you know, and something which is legit. You know, if you can combine those three, I think that that's a really great starting point for something that's really going to garner a lot of attention.
Why do you think happiness is so universal? Why do you think people struggle with it so much?
It's really tricky, because I think that we have so many competing interests, you know, in our lives. I think a big part of it, you know, is that issue of, you know, my book's about success, you know, but I talk a fair amount about happiness, because we often just conflate the two, and that doesn't really work. You know, just because somebody has a lot of money doesn't mean they're happy, and just because somebody's happy doesn't mean they have a lot of money. You know, but obviously, you know, we often get this feeling like if we get power, then that will relate to happiness, and that's not necessarily the case. And if you look at the research by Sonia Lyubomirsky, showed that happiness leads to success more often than success leads to happiness, you know, and that vision of, you know, of power, you know, power is obviously very influential and helps us, especially thousands of years ago, helped us live longer lives. Right. But power is very different from likability, you know, from connecting with others. You know, in fact, you know, there's this balance where the more powerful we feel, often we tend to dehumanize others. Empathy levels decrease. Now, you know, power affords great things in life, you know, a level of safety, comfort, you know, but, you know, likability is the thing that is most correlated with happiness, with connecting with others. And when you look at longitudinal studies that follow people their entire lives, like the Grant study and the Terman study, you know, it turns out across the board that, you know, relationships, you know, are what brings us the most happiness, brings us the most lives. And, you know, power is not connected with it's connected with having relationships, because people want stuff from you, but not with great relationships. So I think we often conflate the two, that, you know, very often we especially when it comes to the issue of work-life balance, we use what's called a collapsing metric, where it's just simpler if we can just track one thing. And if I can just track that one thing and I can make that number go up, everything will be good in life. And you know what? Money's a pretty easy number. So people often think, well, if I just make that number go up, everything will work out. Right. And whereas in many cases, it actually turns out to be the reverse, in the sense that chasing money means devoting your time to work. Devoting your time to work usually means taking your time away from relationships. And relationships are the things that are most connected with meaning in life and happiness. So it needs to be a balance.
You, in one of your blog articles, I found this hilarious. I don't read Dilbert, but I'm almost certain it was a Dilbert comic. And the person said, oh, what should I do to be successful? And the woman goes, like, work every hour of the day, like, give everything up, you know, whatever. And the guy goes, well, that's not going to make me very happy. She goes, you didn't ask me about happiness. And I thought, wow, that's actually really true. Yeah. So so relationship is the key cornerstone. You have the 4 things that, like, people should really think about in their life. Happiness is at the top. Yeah. But what are the other 3?
This was work by Nash and Stevenson at Harvard, and they basically looked at, you know, the issue of kind of like work-life balance and what people led fulfilling lives. And what they found was that, again, that issue of a collapsing metric, just having one number, didn't work, because if you're all focused on money, you forget about relationships, you're all focused on relationships, maybe you can't pay the rent. So, you know, there is a balance here. So the collapsing metric. The other mistake that people frequently make is they try a sequencing strategy, which is, okay, first I'm going to start out and I'm going to do this job that I hate, but I'm going to make lots of money. And then, you know, I'm going to focus on it, and then that's not going to work out, but then I'm finally going to, and it's just, life's not that even, because, you know, obviously it's relationships. You can't just start them when you're in phase 3. It needs regular, consistent behavior. So what they found was that there were actually 4 buckets that people needed to be regularly putting deposits in. The first was happiness, which is basically, are you enjoying what you're doing? The second was achievement. You know, do you have goals, or you're getting closer to them? The third was significance. Is what you're doing having an impact on the people you love and who love you? And then fourth was legacy, which is to some degree or another, are you making a positive impact on the world? And when you think about it, the balance of those four really makes sense because you want to enjoy life and you do need to pay the rent, achieve goals, move forward. And if you feel like what you're doing isn't benefiting the people you love at all, or is, you know, maybe even a negative, you know, that's not going to lead to a meaningful life. And then fourth, you don't want to just be selfish and clannish. You know, you want to think like, I'm doing something to really put something out there. And when you if you look at your schedule for the week, for the month, and you say, I'm making small deposits in each one of those four, that's when you start to be on your way towards a level of work-life balance and towards a level of feeling meaningful, you're having a meaningful life.
It's awesome. I love that. Before I ask my last question, actually, where can these guys find you online?
My URL is a little hard to spell.
Yes, that so I will attest to.
Yes, so if people Google "Barking Up the Wrong Tree" blog, or if they Google Eric Barker, right. they can find the blog and the books "Barking Up the Wrong Tree" on Amazon or other booksellers, or you know, look up my name, Eric Barker, on there.
And I'll save you guys a little bit of time. The Eric Barker who died in the '90s. This is not Eric Barker. So, yeah. Awesome. So my last question, what is the impact that you want to have on the world?
I want to help people make better choices that help them lead better lives. Because, like that William Gibson quote, you know, a lot of these answers are out there. There's a distinction that's made between puzzles and mysteries. Puzzles are things that have an answer. You know, so how many dollars do I have in my pocket? There's an answer to that. We might not know it right now, but there's an answer to that. There's mysteries. There's, you know, what is the meaning of life? There is no clear, immediate answer to that. I think a lot of the things that we think are mysteries are actually puzzles. You know, what do we have to do to be more productive? What do we have to do to live happy lives? What do we have to do to have good relationships? We think often, oh my God, it's this big mystery. No, I think sometimes they're puzzles. Sometimes there are answers. Sometimes there are things we can do, if not to get the perfect solution, to at least get better. And I am obsessive about, you know, doing this blog, you know, writing my book and trying to find these answers so that I can live a better life. And I would feel guilty if I wasn't sharing that, just putting it out there that people can appreciate it and enjoy it, and hopefully use those things to make better decisions that help them live better lives, because the answers are very often there. You know, we just need to connect the answers with the people.
That's awesome. Eric, thank you so much for coming on.
Appreciate it.
Guys, it is very rare that somebody's answer of how they want to impact the world is so in alignment with what they're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. Dive into his work, check out his website. The sheer volume of information is astonishing, and every one of the articles is well worth the time. It is a rabbit hole so deep and compelling, you will go down and not come up for hours, because one thing will lead to the next, and he's very good about at the end of the article, he tells you, there's another one that you might like to read, and you will just keep going and going and going. It is utterly fascinating because he really is going that layer deeper. He's digging into the platitude and asking what part of this is so true that it's become a platitude and it's carried on for so long, and what part of it's false that actually deserves a deeper look, so that we can really find out and take this from being a mystery to being a puzzle that is ultimately solvable. Dive in, you will not regret it. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, and until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care.
All right, thanks. I really appreciate it. That was awesome.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of Impact Theory. If this content is adding value to your life, our one ask is that you go to iTunes and Stitcher and rate and review. Not only does that help us build this community, which at the end of the day is all we care about, but it also helps us get even more amazing guests on here to share their knowledge with all of us. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this community. And until next time, be legendary, my friends.